The cattle were gone, and the wire was singing. Wade Holloway stood at the south gate of the holding pen, with a flashlight in one hand and the cold coming up through his boots. And he listened to the top strand of high tinsel fence hum, the way it always did when the wind crossed it at an angle, and he counted. He counted, because counting was the first thing and the last thing he did every morning of his working life. 31 head should have been standing in the pen, breathing steam, shifting their weight, waiting on the feed truck. The pen held 19. The gate was latched. The chain was looped twice through the hasp the way he looped it every night. The carabiner clipped, the keeper closed. He ran the light along the fence line post to post, and the wire ran clean and tight and unbroken from the corner brace all the way down to the loading chute, and not one strand sagged and not one staple had pulled. He stood there a while longer than a sensible man would have. The number did not change. He knew it would not change. He had learned a long time ago that the number was the number, that wanting a different answer was a way to get yourself hurt, and he did not want a different answer so much as he wanted an explanation, and there wasn't one. 12 animals do not leave a closed pen through a fence that has not been touched. They do not climb. They do not fly. They do not file out a gate that is still chained from the inside of his own habit. Wade was 54 years old, and he had run cattle on the leased ground east of the river for 19 of those years, and before that he had worked another man's herd for 11, and before that he had grown up on a place where the difference between a good fence and a bad one was the difference between eating and not. He knew fence the way some men know engines. He could read a wire by the way it caught light. He could tell you which posts had heaved in the spring and which had held, which staples were backing out and which would hold another decade. And he checked all of it every week, walking the perimeter with a roll of wire and a pair of fencing pliers and a bucket of staples, because the perimeter was the whole job. Keep them in. Keep what was outside, outside. That was the agreement a man made with the ground when he leased it, and Wade had kept his end for 19 years without losing more than the ordinary attrition of weather and age and the occasional animal that found the one weak place a careless man left. His mornings ran the same shape they had always run up before the alarm, because his body had stopped needing it years ago. Coffee made the way his father made it, ground straight in the pot and the water poured off the boil, no filter, the grit settling to the bottom of a steel cup he had carried since his first season on his own. Boots laced sitting on the bench by the door. The drive down to the pen in the dark with the radio off, because he liked to listen to the engine, and the engine liked to be listened to. He fed at first light and counted while he fed, every animal, every morning. Not because he expected the number to be wrong, but because a man who only counts when he expects trouble is a man who finds his trouble too late. He had a notebook in the truck where he wrote the count each day in pencil. A column of numbers going back years, and the column was boring, which was the point. 31. 31. A boring column was a column that said you had done your job. He did not exaggerate. It was the one thing his neighbors would have said about him if you asked. The men at the co-op, and the fellow who hauled for him, and the vet who came out for the spring work. Wade Holloway did not make a thing bigger than it was. If he told you a calf weighed 500 pounds, it weighed 500 pounds and not 490. If he told you the creek had come up 2 feet, it had come up 2 feet. He had built a whole life on being the man whose word matched the world. And he knew the worth of that, and he knew standing at the gate that morning that it was about to cost him. Because the thing he had to say now did not match any world a sensible man believed in, and he was going to have to say it anyway. He was not a careless man. That was the thing he kept coming back to as he stood at the gate, with the wire humming. There was no weak place. He had walked the fence on Tuesday, 2 days back, the entire 2-mile loop, and he had pulled one loose staple near the creek crossing and driven it home and moved on, and the rest of it had been sound. Whatever had taken 12 animals out of his pen had done it across 40 hours through a perimeter he could vouch for with his hands, and it had left the perimeter exactly as he left it. He walked the inside of the pen first, slow, the light low, and raking so it would throw shadow into any disturbance in the dirt. The ground inside the pen was churned to powder by hooves, which was no help, but he was not looking at the center. He was looking at the edges, the place where the dirt met the bottom wire, where an animal pushing out under tension would have dug in and dragged. He found nothing. The bottom wire stood 8 inches off the ground, tight, and the dirt under it was undisturbed. No scrape, no hollow, no tuft of hide caught on a barb, because this fence had no barbs. It was smooth, high tensile, 5 strands, and an animal does not pass through 5 strands of smooth wire, spaced 8 inches apart, without leaving the wire singing in a different key. He shut the light off and stood in the dark and let his eyes adjust and listened. The river was a low sound to the west. The wind came across the wire. Somewhere far off, a truck downshifted on the county road, and the sound carried the way. Sound carries over flat ground before dawn. The cattle that were left stood close together against the north rail, closer than cattle stand on a normal night. And they were not chewing, and they were not lying down, and that bothered him before he had a word for why. By the time the sky began to gray, he had walked the inside of the pen twice and the outside of it once, and found nothing he could put his hand on, and he drove the half-mile back to the house with the heater running and his jaw set, and did the arithmetic he did not want to do. 12 head, at the weight they were carrying and the price they were running. 12 head was the back half of his year. He ran the figure as he drove, slow, the way he ran any figure in round, honest numbers he could trust. The market was near $1,800 a head for what he was carrying. 12 of them was better than $20,000 standing in a pen one night and gone the next. That was the lease payment that came due in October. That was the diesel for the winter feeding. That was the part of the operating loan that wasn't already spoken for at the bank in town, where a man named Pruitt had carried him through 2 bad years on a handshake and a lien, and would want to know when Wade came in exactly what had happened to the collateral. And Wade would have to sit in the chair across from Pruitt's desk and tell him the cattle were gone and the fence had not been touched, and he could already see the look that would put on a banker's face. It was not a loss he could absorb and keep going the way he had been going, and that was the cold practical fact sitting under the stranger fact, which was that he could not say where they had gone. He pulled into the yard as the first real light came over the river, and sat in the truck a minute with the engine ticking before he went in. The dog should have come off the porch to meet him. The dog was a 6-year-old heeler named Tick, who met the truck every morning of her life, who slept on the porch with one ear up, and announced every coyote in every car and every stranger within a half-mile. Tick was not on the porch. He found her under it, pressed back into the dark against the foundation block, flat to the ground with her ears pinned and her eyes showing white, and she would not come out when he called her. And she had never in 6 years not come when he called her. And he crouched down and put his hand back into the dark, and she licked it once and shivered and stayed where she was. He left her there. There was nothing to do about a thing a dog knew that you didn't. Dana was up when he came in, standing at the counter in his old flannel with her hands around a mug, and she read his face the way she had read it for 26 years. "How many?" she said. 19. She set the mug down. "Out of 31. Out of 31. Where's the fence down? It's not. He said, that's the part. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and stood there in his socks because she did not allow boots past the mat. And he told her what he had found, which was nothing, and she listened the way she always listened without filling the silence. She had been married to him long enough to know that if Wade Holloway said the fence had not been touched, the fence had not been touched. That was worth something. In a marriage. It was also this morning the worst possible thing she could have given him, because it meant the problem was real. Tick won't come out from under the porch, he said. Dana looked at him for a moment. She had grown up on ground like this around animals, and she knew what a dog under a porch meant the same way he did. Since when? Since this morning, maybe before. I didn't look last night. He poured himself a cup of the coffee she'd made, and did not drink it. She licked my hand and wouldn't move. Tick, call Garrett, she said. Get it on paper before you do anything else. Garrett was the county brand inspector, and she was right. And Wade called them at 7 and left a message and called the sheriff's non-emergency line after that and gave the dispatcher the bones of it. 12 head missing, fence intact, gate chain. The dispatcher took it down in the flat voice of someone entering a code and asked if he'd seen any vehicles, any cut wire, any sign of a trailer, and Wade said no to all of it, and he heard the woman's interest fall away with each. No, because a cattle theft is a trailer and a cut fence and tire tracks? She said a deputy would follow up. He knew what that meant. It meant the report would sit in a stack of reports about things that had an obvious cause. And his would be the one without a cause, and it would sink. He went back out at full light because daylight owes you a second look. The pen in the morning was an ordinary pen. The dirt was dirt. The wire was wire. The 19 that were left had loosened up some with the sun and gone back to grazing the trampled hay along the rail, and the sight of them being ordinary almost let him believe he had counted wrong in the dark, and he walked the fence line a third time to kill that idea. Because a man who lets himself believe the comfortable thing is a man who stops checking. He found the first wrong thing 40 minutes into the walk at the northeast corner, where the fence turned to follow the old tree line that marked the lease boundary. It was not a break. It was a smell. He came around the corner, brace in the wind shifted, and he caught it full, and he stopped walking, and his body understood it before his mind sorted it. It was a heavy, low smell, musk and wet hide, and something rotten under it, the smell of a den or a kill site, and it was strong enough that his eyes watered, and there was no animal in sight to make it. This was not bear. He had smelled the place where coyotes had worked a carcass. This was not that either. It was thicker. It sat on the back of the throat. He stood in it for a count of 10, and then it was gone. The wind taking it off down the tree line, and he was left standing at a sound fence in the clean morning air, wondering if he had smelled it at all. He marked the corner in his mind and kept walking and found the second wrong thing. 50 yards on the grass along the outside of the fence, in the strip between the wire and the trees, was pressed flat. Not trampled away deer bed grass in a loose oval. Pressed flat in a line, a path, maybe 2 feet wide, running parallel to the fence on the outside of it. And the grass had not sprung back, which meant weight and recent weight, and a lot of it moving along the fence the way Wade himself moved along the fence. He crouched and put his hand flat in the pressed grass and felt nothing he could name and saw nothing. No print in the matted stems, because the ground there was sod and would not take a print, and he followed the pressed line with his eyes, and it ran north along the trees until the angle took it out of sight. Something had walked his fence. On the outside, following it the way a man checks a perimeter, and it had not been looking for a way through, because there was no way through. The fence was whole. He did not finish the loop that morning. He told himself it was because he needed to be at the co-op before they closed the order window. And that was true, and it was also a lie. And they all heard the lie land, the part of him that said it, and the part of him that knew better. He drove to the co-op and stood at the counter while Lyle behind it filled the mineral order he did not need. And two men he had known for years were drinking coffee at the table by the window. And one of them, a hay grower named Ostrander, whose ground ran along the river north of Wade's lease, asked him how the cattle were doing in that flat way. Men ask each other things they don't expect a real answer to. Wade started to say, "Fine." Then he stopped, because the not saying was its own kind of lie, and he asked instead whether Ostrander had lost anything lately, or heard anything up along the river. Ostrander set his cup down. He was a careful man, too, in his way, and he took a moment. He said he'd had 2 calves go in the spring and never found a scrap of them. No carcass, no hide. Nothing for the coyotes to have left. Which wasn't how coyotes worked. Coyotes left you something. He said his border collie had quit going down to the river bottom altogether, wouldn't cross the fence line into the lower pasture, and a stock dog that won't work is a dog telling you something. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided not to think about. And then he picked his cup back up and the window had closed on it. And Wade understood that he was not the first and that the others had all done what he was doing right now, which was to fold the wrong thing up small. He came home and got the rifle down from the cabinet, a bolt-action .30-06 his father had carried, and he cleaned it at the kitchen table while Dana cooked. Ran a patch down the bore and worked the bolt and counted the rounds in the box, though he knew the count, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing to say that would not have made it bigger than he was ready to let it be. Dana made a pork roast and potatoes. A heavy meal. The kind she made when she wanted the house to feel like an ordinary house. And they ate it at the table with the radio on low. And it almost worked. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the dark came down over the river ground, and somewhere under the porch, the dog lay flat against the foundation and would not come in, even to eat. And Wade got up twice during the meal and looked out the north window at nothing and sat back down. And the third time he did it, Dana reached across and put her hand on his wrist. Not to stop him, just to mark that she had seen. And he left his hand under hers a moment and then went back to his plate. Garrett, the brand inspector, came the next afternoon, a square man near 60 with a clipboard and reading glasses, and he walked the pen with Wade and ran his own hand along the bottom wire and stood at the chained gate and said what Wade already knew, which was that he had never in 30 years written up a loss like this one. He arrived in a county truck with a magnetic seal on the door, and he did not hurry. He walked the whole pen first without saying anything, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the dirt and the rail and the gate the way a man looks at a thing he intends to remember. And then he came back to the gate and lifted the chain in his hand and let it fall, and lifted it again, feeling the weight of it and the way it was looped. The keeper. He had written up theft, plenty of it, and theft had a shape. He had written up animals that wandered through downed fence in a storm. He had written up the rare animal taken by a big cat up in the breaks. None of it looked like this. He pushed his glasses up and looked at the unbroken wire, and said the only honest thing there was to say, "I don't know what to put on this, Wade. Put down what you see. What I see is 19 head, where there ought to be 31 and a fence I'd swear an oath on." He wrote for a while, the pen scratching, and then he stopped and looked up over the glasses. "You checked the whole loop. Most of it. Found a smell at the northeast corner, found grass pressed down along the outside, a path like something walking the line." Garrett looked up. "Cat'll pace a fence." "It wasn't a cat." "How do you know?" Wade thought about the smell and the width of the pressed path and the way the 19 had stood against the rail, and he did not have an answer he could defend, so he gave the one he could. "I don't," he said. "But I've seen cat sign. This isn't it." Garrett held his eye a moment, and then he nodded. Slow, and Wade saw that the older man had walked a lot of fence lines in 30 years, and had maybe stood at one or two he didn't talk about, because there was something in the way he took the not knowing, without argument, without the reach for an easy word, that told Wade he was not the first man Garrett had heard say, "This isn't it," about a fence that should have held. Garrett wrote that down too, the not knowing, because he was an honest man, and when he was done he tore the carbon and handed Wade the copy and stood looking north toward the tree line for a moment with the wind moving his coat. "There was a fellow up in the next county years back," Garrett said, and then he stopped himself and shook his head once, and did not finish it. "You call me if it happens again. And Wade, you see anything up in those trees you don't like, you don't go in after it? Stock's insured? You're not." He got in the truck and pulled the door shut and drove off down the section road, and left Wade alone with a piece of paper that proved nothing except that a second man had looked at the impossible thing and could not explain it either. That was worth something. The lie a man tells himself in the dark is that he is imagining it. Garrett had taken that lie away. Whatever this was, it was real enough to put two grown men at a fence with nothing to say. The second night, Wade did not sleep in the house. He sat up in the bed of the truck with a rifle, and a thermos and a wool blanket, and parked it at the high point of the lease, where he could see the pen and most of the north fence line in the moonlight, and he sat with his back against the cab and watched. The moon was 3/4, and the ground gave back enough light to see the shapes of the cattle and the gray line of the fence. He did not use the light. A light makes you blind to everything outside its circle, and worse, it tells everything outside the circle exactly where you are. And Wade had hunted enough to know that the man holding the light, for a long time there was nothing but the ordinary night. The cattle stood and shifted. An owl crossed the pen and was gone. The river talked to itself. He poured coffee from the thermos and held the cup more for the warmth, then the drink, and watched the fence line go from gray to silver as the moon climbed. And he let his mind run back over the 3 days the way he ran back over a fence after a storm, looking for the one place that gave, the pressed grass, the smell at the corner, the 11-inch stride he had not measured yet but had already seen in the leaves, Ostrander's 2 calves with not a scrap left, the dog under the porch. Tick had still been under there at dark, and he had carried her a bowl of food and set it in the dirt within reach of her nose, and she had not touched it. And a healer that won't eat is a healer that has decided eating is not the priority, and the priority for an animal is always staying alive. He turned all of it over, and none of it fit together into anything he had a name for, and the not fitting was the whole trouble. Because pattern was the thing that kept you alive, and he had no pattern, only a column of facts that pointed at a hole in the middle where the answer should have been. And then, sometime past 2 by the truck's clock, the night changed, and it changed the way the woods change. When the hunter you didn't know was there has decided to move, which is to say it went quiet, the owl did not call again. The wind, which had been steady out of the west, died to nothing, and into that nothing the 19 head in the pen came awake all at once and bunched, and Wade felt the hair stand up on his arms before he had seen a single thing, because the cattle had told him, the way cattle always tell you, that they were not alone. He brought the rifle up slow and put his eye to the scope and swept the north fence line and saw nothing. The pen. The fence. The black wall of the trees beyond. he swept it again slower. And on the third pass, just inside the tree line, well, back from the fence, at a height that was wrong, he found the eyes, 2 of them, set wide, catching the moon and throwing it back, amber, low and steady. Not the green of a coyote and not the gold green of a cat, and not at the height of either, because they were higher than a man's eyes would be. If a man were standing back in those trees and they did not bob the way a walking animal's eyes bob and they did not blink, they held on the pin, they held on the cattle, they were not looking at Wade, and that was the only mercy in it, that the thing in the trees was looking at his animals and had not yet found the truck on the rise. He held the crosshair on the space between the eyes, and he did not fire, because there is a rule older than law that you do not put a round into a thing you cannot identify. And because the cattle were past it in the line of fire, and because some part of him below thought understood that a shot would not be a beginning, it would be a provocation. And he was not ready to provoke a thing he could not even name. So he held, and it held, and the 2 of them stayed locked across 200 yards of moonlit ground while the cattle trembled against the rail, and Wade learned the particular fear that is not panic, because panic is loud and this was silent, the fear of being on the wrong side of the math, of being the smaller animal, of having brought a tool to a problem that did not respect tools. The eyes dropped, not turned away, dropped the way a head lowers, and the dark shape that he could now half see resolved into the suggestion of a back, a long, low line moving behind the trees parallel to the fence. North, the same direction as the pressed grass, and Wade tracked it with the scope and lost it where the trees thickened and did not find it again. The frogs did not start back up for a long time. He sat in the truck bed until the sky grayed and his hands had stopped wanting to shake, and dawn bled slowly into the trees and proved nothing at all. And when there was light enough, he climbed down and counted, and the count was 19, and for the first time in 2 days, because it meant only that the thing had come to watch and not to take. And a thing that watches is a thing that is learning. He walked to the tree line where the eyes had been. The smell was there again, fainter, the musk and the rot, hanging in the still air under the trees. The ground back in the trees was soft with old leaf litter, and it had taken an impression. And Wade crouched over it with his heart going hard, and made himself look at it the way he would look at any sign, flatly measuring. It was not a track he knew. It was long, longer than his own boot, by a third, and it was not round like a cat, and not neat like a deer, and not splayed like a bear, and there were marks at the front of it, 4 of them, deep set forward of the pad, that he did not want to call what they looked like. He laid his fencing pliers down beside it for scale, and took a picture with his phone, and hated how the phone made it look small and ordinary and explainable. A smear in the leaves. Nothing when crouched over it in the cold, with the smell in his throat. It had been none of those things. He found a second impression 11 inches ahead of the first. He found a third, the same distance on B. 11 inches between them, which was nothing, which was a slow walk, a stroll, an animal in no hurry at all moving along the outside of a fence. It could not be bothered to break, because it did not need to. 11 inches. He stood there and turned the number over. A coyote's walking stride ran shorter, a big cat longer, but the track was wrong. 11 inches at that depth in that litter meant weight on each step, real weight, and a gait that was unhurried. And he stood at his own fence, with his own pliers in his own hand, and understood that he had no category for the thing whose sign he was reading. And the not knowing was worse than any answer would have been. Because pattern was the thing that kept you alive, and he had no pattern for this. He drove to town and sat in the sheriff's office for 40 minutes and showed the deputy the photographs, and the deputy was young and polite, and looked at the smear in the leaves and the pressed grass and the chained gate, and Wade watched him try to fit it into something he understood and fail, and the failure came out as reassurance, which is what failure always sounds like in a uniform. The deputy scrolled through the photographs on Wade's phone with his thumb, the track and the pressed path and the empty pen, and he held on the track photograph a moment longer than the others, and Wade saw something cross his face before the training closed over it. "Probably a cat," the deputy said. "They get big up in the breaks, lions, and a lion will pace a fence for days working out the easy meals." He would make a note. He would let the game warden know there might be a lion working the river ground. Wade said the word lion did not fit the sign, that he had measured the stride and the stride was wrong for a cat, and the track had marks at the front that a cat's track did not have. And the deputy said sign could be misleading at night, that the light played tricks, that a man out alone after losing stock could read more into a smear of leaves than was in it, and he did not say it unkindly, which was worse, and Wade understood that he had crossed the line from a man with a problem to a man with a story, and that no help was coming from that building. He took his phone back and put it in his pocket and thanked the deputy, and shook his hand, because the deputy was not a bad young man, he was only a man with a stack of reports that had causes, and no room in the stack for one that didn't, and he drove home in the early dark and did not tell Dana how the meeting had gone, only that it had gone the way